I'm Nichole Suvar, and you're listening to the Caretakers Journey podcast.
Welcome to this week's episode. I'm your host, Carole Leathem, and our meaningful conversation this week deals with anxiety. And I am so excited to welcome my friend Nicole to the show. Nicole is one of the most authentic and transparent people that I have met, and she is going to open our eyes as not a caretaker, but as one who struggles with anxiety. And I am excited to unpack this conversation. Let me tell you just a little bit about my friend Nicole. Nicole is a recovering perfectionist. Love that. She's an anxiety fighter. I'm going to steal that. And she is an intentional living strategist. She desires for others to know that they are created for a purpose, and that even the struggle of anxiety can be a tool to help us point to our Savior and a life that brings glory to Him. Amen. I'm like, oh my gosh, guys, are you getting excited yet? You should be. Nicole has contributed to several devotionals. She has been on Proverbs 31, Freedom from Worry. She recently published her own book, Numbering Our Days, which is the subtitle, Combating Anxiety and the Power of a Small Intentional Moment. She has also published devotionals for Advent, Preparing Him Room, and she is she's an intentional Advent and Easter. Sorry, I'm really slaughtering this, Nicole. But she has written a lot about Advent and Easter victory in the wilderness. She's an intentional Easter, which can be purchased through her website. And we're going to give you that link at the end. Nicole's a writer for Self-Care 365 app, and I have been on that app, and I love that app. So I'm excited to talk to her more about that. And it's Remedy Live, which is an app that helps focus on the wellness with your mental health. She has also been a guest on lots of podcasts and blogs, as well as a speaker for Empathy for Great Kids, Great Communities, and the initiative in Fort Wayne, Indiana. She lives in Fort Wayne, Indiana, with her high school sweetheart, husband Paul, and their 3 children. And in her free time, she enjoys training for half marathons. Okay, now I'm jealous. Discovering new hiking paths, or curling up with a new good mystery novel. She writes about living an overcoming life for Jesus, one intentional moment at a time. Let me read that again. She writes about living an overcoming life for Jesus, one intentional moment at a time. So, Nicole, I am sorry for slaughtering your bio this morning, and I'm going to be true to my not editing process here. And I just want to welcome you to the show, and I'm excited for my listeners to get to know you. So welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm so sorry. I read that like 5 times out loud, and I was like, I know I'm going to mess this up. But our show is all about authenticity, transparency, and I made a commitment to not do a lot of editing. And so when I mess up like that, I just want people to know, grab your cup of coffee and dive in, just join us, because we are having real life conversations here.
Yes.
And I don't know about you, but my life can get pretty messy. Yeah. So let me just ask, let's just dive in. So Nicole, you and I met last February in the beautiful Smoky Mountains of Tennessee at a camp for creatives. And I want you to know, from the first moment, we're in a mastermind group together. And from the first moment I sat down, I loved her because she was honest about where she was. We were in a group to talk about being stuck. And so I just want to, I remember that. And I just remember watching you that weekend as you got feedback from all kinds of different people and applied it, which is huge, because how many times do we get the opportunity to get feedback and then we don't apply it? So I watched you like rocket off of that mountain. Yeah. So Nicole, share a little bit more about yourself with our listeners this morning.
Yeah. Aside from the writing and the different things you shared about already, I work full time for a foster care agency. So that's kind of takes up a lot of my days. So my writing happens a lot from like 5 to 6 a.m. or all those little spaces in between. We have 3 teenagers. So although one of them can drive, one of them's going through driving lessons, the other one I still have to get to all the places. Like there's just a lot of juggling that's happening. I do enjoy hiking. I do enjoy running. but I also really enjoy dry red wine and
Oh,
watching the sunset while
yes.
drinking one of those. And
Yes.
I will never turn down an opportunity to eat cheese and crackers.
I like cheesy crackers too. My
Yeah.
granddaughter and I were talking about making cheesy crackers this morning because we both like them a lot. I think my son-in-law likes them too. That is so cool. So you work in the foster care system. So you probably come in contact with a lot of caretakers that have people they're caring for that have mental health issues.
Yeah.
So I just want to say now that I know that about you, which I didn't, I'd forgotten that. That's going to be another show. We'll have you come back and talk about that in the future. This morning, I want to talk. I really, as you could tell when I was reading your bio, when we got to that last part where it talks about living an overcoming life for Jesus, one intentional moment at a time. Your ministry is called The Intentional Life, and you encourage people to take those small moments of every day to intentionally seek out Jesus in every area of their life. So, talk to us about the ministry and how did that start?
Yeah. So the intentional life. I could even just talk about my dad for a minute. He was in the Navy, and he actually was on submarines at some point in time. And
Wow.
I remember him talking about like how a submarine is built, how it's built into compartments, so that if a portion of it gets hit, like they will close off some of those compartments that may be filled with water, so that the whole sub doesn't completely sink and everything is lost.
Okay.
And that is something I've kind of taken into as I've gotten older and thinking about just the anxiety that I've struggled with, how anxiety can completely overwhelm like every aspect of your life.
Yeah.
It will put you into a state of freeze, like there's just nothing else you could, like you cannot get out of it, or it puts you to this point of like just wanting to do all the things, and so you're just moving, but not really accomplishing anything.
Yeah.
Because your body's just telling you have to keep moving. And so I would start looking into that in my life and looking at ways like, how can I compartmentalize things and then be intentional in that compartment where I'm at, so that if something does hit me in one part of my life, it doesn't sink the whole ship.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
So I would start just looking at like the small moment that's right in front of me, that compartment
Okay.
that's right in front of me, and intentional with that moment. So intentional means that we're not living on autopilot and we're not living by habit, but that we're actually putting thought into why we're doing what we're doing. And I think as Christ followers, that is something that should be an aim of ours, that we aren't just living out of habit and just floating through life. Like we are all put here for a purpose. And when we are a Christ follower, the purpose becomes even more like aware to us, because we're living for God. We're not living for ourselves.
Absolutely.
So like Psalm 90:12, which is kind of a basis of like all of the intentional life, is teach us to number our days that we may have a heart of wisdom. And so thinking about the fact that like we were placed here for a number of days, and that's not supposed to stress us out like, oh no, we have limited time, but really the fact that like, no, you were placed here for a purpose, and just being intentional with that moment that is there right in front of you. And the purpose is living for God and pointing others to Him.
Wow. Okay. I love that illustration of the submarine, because so many times I'm a picture person. And so it's really important for me sometimes to grasp a picture in my mind of what I'm trying to do. And I always talk about living in the moment, because when you're dealing with anxiety, or when you're caring for somebody who's dealing with anxiety, the moments are really critical, and how you respond or how you don't respond in that moment is so important. So how long have you been doing this ministry, and what prompted you to step out of your comfort zone and start being so authentic and transparent and sharing what you've learned about, living in the moment with anxiety?
Yeah. So I have been living with an undiagnosed anxiety disorder for most of my life.
Okay.
Going back through memory, my first memories are like when I was 8.
Okay.
Of panic attacks, of never being able to sleep. I actually was diagnosed with ulcers. But not, like in that language back in the 90s, there was not the talk of like anxiety was not a thing.
No.
In fact, I was just told, like I was kind of coined that in my family. I was the worry wart. Like you don't have to worry about it because Nicole's going to worry about it. So there was one part of me that was like, okay, that's my job. But the other part is like, but I don't want to keep doing this. And so
Yeah.
when I would talk about my worries, I was just told like, it's no big deal. Just don't worry about it. Well, I couldn't ever shut it off.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I was in my mid 30s where I was like on my third round of like a suicidal episode,
Wow.
um, that I actually called a hotline. And that is where it started as far as like getting a diagnosis and realizing like, oh, okay, this isn't how I should be. Like this, there's an alternative to living life than the way that I'm living it right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I have generalized anxiety disorder. And once I had that diagnosis, it's just interesting. Like once you can have a name to something, then you can start working towards the healing of it. And as I was working through the healing of it, I was doing a lot of writing, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
journaling, and I was just starting to put it online. And it really started resonating with people. And so I just kept putting it online and
I
just
want
kept
to.
sharing.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I want to dive in. You've said a couple of really great little nuggets in here. The first one is how brave it is to talk about the fact that you finally called a hotline
Yeah.
because you were suicidal. So, in my experience with my husband, that is what we came to. That's kind of the head that we came to. He became suicidal and called a hotline. And if you are listening, and I just want to take like a little side note here, and if you are listening to this today and you are feeling suicidal, you're feeling like you don't want to live
Mm-hmm.
anymore, the anxiety is overwhelming you, please, please, please ask for help. There are
Mm-hmm.
so many great counselors that work on the hotline. So that's the first thing I want to dive into here is make sure that if you are listening to this and you or your loved one is struggling with this, immediately reach out. There is no shame. There is only hope and help that can be found through that. So I want to just take that little note here. And then I
Yeah.
want to talk for a second about the difference between living with an undiagnosed anxiety issue and then knowing that you have the generalized anxiety disorder. Because I think your secret is partially in understanding who your enemy is. And your
Mm-hmm.
enemy is this disease, this generalized anxiety disorder, that now you can take steps to go, okay, this is what it is. Now, this is how we're going to fight it. Does that sound correct?
Yeah. Because there were like for years, I grew up at a Christian home. I've known about Jesus from as young as I would know who Jesus is. But I also kind of bought into the understanding that like I mean throughout scripture it tells us not to fear
Yeah.
and cast all your worries on him
Mm-hmm.
and so I would be reading the scripture and I wanted to do that but I couldn't. So
Mm-hmm.
there was so much shame surrounding that and
Yep.
I very much just tied it directly to faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that we might even talk about this later as well, but when I started to separate out the parts of it that are faith and parts of it that are a biological thing that's going on in our
Yes.
bodies, that helps me be able to start addressing it in the right way. And it's like that's part of those 7 areas that I talk about being intentional, and I write about that in my book Numbering Our Days. The very first one starts with the heart, and it's so important to make sure that we are right with God,
Mm-hmm.
and then everything else trickles from there. So heart is first, and then it's our thoughts, our health, money, relationships, home, and time. So those are all the different areas to be intentional with, but it's very important. Heart first. But then there's
Mm-hmm.
also understanding that it's not always just that
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to our
Oh,
anxiety.
I know for my husband and I, when we began this journey, there were times where I would get so frustrated with people because they would just say, well, he just doesn't have enough faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go, that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
It's not true. This is a person who has so much faith. It's incredible. But there was a part of his brain that was not was not syncing
Yep.
and firing on all cylinders. And
Yep.
he needed the medication to help him. And so calling the hotline, and then for him, he had to go into a psychiatric hospital for a week. And while he was there, they began to do testing and figure things out. But ultimately, I had to take him to a private clinic, and we had to do this whole thing with medication. And finally, when we got the right medication and the right therapy and the right understanding, all
Yeah.
of a sudden we could create what we have now, which is for the majority of the time, he lives a pretty calm, healthy life. But I can always tell when the anxiety kicks back in as the caregiver, and I can watch him And I can see it's almost like he gets on a hamster wheel, can't get off.
Yep.
And there's, and at that point, sometimes you have to have, yes. So thank you for for sharing that with us. So let's talk for a second about these intentional moments. So for you, what does one of these intentional moments, what does it look like? Just kind of draw a picture for us, or a word picture for us of what an intentional moment might look like for you.
So I was just starting with the heart, and making sure that I'm starting every day with Jesus. I know that we'll hear that and we're kind of like, oh yeah, I know. But are we really
Yes.
spending our very first moments with him? Or is it grabbing a phone and scrolling something, or checking for notifications, or we keep hitting snooze to the point that, like, okay, now I have to get up and rush right into the day.
Yes.
So, and I know we're all going to have those moments, but being intentional and being disciplined in making our very first breath be towards God.
Mm-hmm.
Some people they're like, I can't get into devotions as soon as I wake up. I'm going to fall back asleep. I hear you. I totally understand.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes if there's those mornings where I get my cup of coffee and I'm standing at the counter and all I'm doing is just standing in silence, taking that sip of coffee and just aligning my thoughts with him. Sometimes it's listening to a psalm.
Yes.
Because sometimes my brain cannot comprehend Romans at 5 a.m., but a psalm
Yes.
or a proverb that I can read over and I can just talk with God about, like just starting the day with him, just being intentional with that. Yeah, I guess that's just one I could think of.
You know, I love that. One of my favorite things that I do is I get up in the morning and I talk about how the act of brewing my coffee is where I start getting into my kind of aligning my thoughts with God. And really brewing my coffee in the morning is where I stand at the counter like you're talking about, and I just start putting myself mentally and physically in this position or posture of, okay, God, today's a new day. What are we going to do? Going through what I'm going to do. And I love that in our technology, we can listen to scripture or worship music just by pushing a button on our phone. And that's so, I love that. It's so critical. So I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. I just love how open and transparent and authentic you are about this, because I just think that helps other people. It helps us normalize what is not understood. And there are so many people that just don't. And I learned this 8 years ago when my husband began to struggle. People don't get it. They don't understand what anxiety is. And his journey is very much like yours, where he can go back to 4 years old, where someone said, don't worry about that, you know? And now I can remember when you were talking, I remember a family member saying the exact same thing to him. Well, we don't have to worry about it because he will worry about it. And we've made jokes. People have made jokes about the worry. And yet you have journeyed through this. So when you finally got the diagnosis, let's talk a little bit. Let's go a little bit deeper about what that journey, how did that change the journey of anxiety for you when you finally got that diagnosis and understood what you were fighting?
Yeah, I think a big thing was it helped take away some of that shame that for the longest time I thought I just wasn't a good enough Christian. I just wasn't praying enough. I wasn't in the Bible enough. And to realize like that part of that struggle was actually, some chemicals in my brain that weren't working. And like I had my doctor explained that I had been living in such a high state of anxiety for so long that those reuptake inhibitors had stopped. Yes, they had stopped producing what they needed to produce. And when that tanks, then that's when the depression sets in. And then when the depression sets in, that's when the suicidal ideation started. So just having that thought of like, oh, okay, there's like a chemical, like this thing that's actually happening versus like yes, God can heal. Miracles happen. I mean, you were just talking to me earlier about a miracle, but there's also like we need to be looking at anxiety and depression and these other diagnoses as we
Mm-hmm.
would that if I was said, I have a heart condition and now I need to take this medication. Like
Oh.
we need
Yeah, you
we
just
need to
pulled it.
normalize this.
You just pulled a chapter from my book. You just
Okay.
pulled a chapter from my book because we need to normalize it. We need to have these conversations. And that's why I was excited to have you on the show to talk, because from a caretaker's perspective, we talk a lot about what it's like to care and love someone who struggles. I I love that you are coming at it from the opposite. You are the one who struggles with it. So
Mm-hmm.
for all of my caretakers who are listening today, you are helping us because there is a shame that surrounds this. There is a fear of what if we can't get this under control. There
Mm-hmm.
is a misunderstanding within the walls of the church. And I'll just give you a little teaser. For the month of July, I'm talking with a mental health professional about mental health and the church.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's so much that we're going to do a 4-part series in the month of
Okay.
July on this, because I want you to know that the church and Christians do a great disservice to those of us who care and love and those who struggle,
Yeah.
because we don't understand that. So I was at a conference and this man walked up and he said to me, oh, struggles with, anxiety, depression, oh my gosh, what a lack of faith. And I
Mm.
looked at him and I said, oh, you need glasses? And he said, well, yeah. And I go, well, don't wear them. Well, I couldn't see. I'm like, well, then what's the difference between taking a pill to take care of the things in your brain? The conversation was a little more extended than this. But the truth is, we need glasses. We put glasses on. We're a diabetic. We take insulin. If there's a part of our body that's not working, we figure out a way to bypass it or help it.
Mm-hmm.
And mental illness, a lot of the times, mental illness is the need for that reuptake is not working. You're not producing the serotonin. We need to help the brain. And sometimes the brain can repair itself and sometimes it
Sometimes
can't.
you can't. Yep.
And that's a hard thing. But by having these conversations, we're removing the shame. We're removing the confusion. We're normalizing it. We're saying it's okay. God
Yeah.
still loves you. God is still involved, and there's nothing wrong other than your brain needs a little bit of help. So, what would you tell someone? I'm going to ask you a 2-part question here. What would you tell someone who is struggling? And then what would you tell someone who loves someone who's struggling?
Yeah. So I would want to tell them that your struggle does not disqualify you.
Woo.
For years, that's what I thought. I thought that because I could not figure out this anxiety, that it's disqualified me in my place in the kingdom. And I couldn't really be used by God until I had that figured out. But the reality is, like, even if we're struggling, if we are still seeking Jesus and we are still wanting to live for his glory and pointing others to him, that we are worthy and we are needed. We do not, like, I know that we think we have to get our act together to come to Jesus for him to save us. I mean, we know that part. We're like, yes, we know. You don't need to, like, he's the one that does the saving. But
Right.
the same thing, like, even once we are saved and redeemed, if we're still struggling, it's not a shame that we need to kind of hide. We need, like, keep bringing it back to him. And he's not mad. He's not going to disqualify you because your struggle continues.
Okay, so stop right there, because I want to make sure the listeners hear this. When you struggle, it does not disqualify you.
Yeah.
And I think so many times we think it does. In so many different ways, it disqualifies. We feel like that, and it's not true. And so I love that truth. You are loved by God. You are worthy. And I have loved watching you bloom over the last few months, because I got to see you in February when you were kind of at a point of, what do I do next? And one of the things you said in our conversation that we were having in the group that day was, I don't feel worthy.
Mm,
Remember that?
yeah.
And I remember there were a couple of us, we stopped you and we're like, no, it's not true. And I think that there are probably people that are feeling not worthy. And oh my gosh, if they could walk away from this episode with anything, if you're struggling, it doesn't disqualify you. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
So then let's change directions a little bit. And for someone who struggles
Mm-hmm.
with the anxiety, tell our listeners, how can we as caretakers love and support our loved one who struggles? What is it that we can do that would be the most helpful?
Yeah, there's one of my talks that I do is upgrading our mental health toolkit, and the name of it is called "Just Calm Down," because because that is what I heard my whole life.
Oh
Like,
my gosh.
you need to just calm down. That is not that big a deal. Don't worry about it. Like, those are the things. Like, even myself, I have a daughter who can kind of get overwhelmed by things easily. And I want to say, calm down, or not, it's not that big a deal. Like, that's even for me who knows it's not the thing to say. It's just the easiest thing to say.
Yeah.
So coming up with better phrasing
Yes.
for someone who's struggling with anxiety, and in your mind, you're like, oh my goodness, this is not that big a deal.
Yeah.
The truth is, they probably know that also,
Mm-hmm.
but they know it, but their body does not.
Right.
And it makes the rest of them, like their whole body feels like something is a really big deal and they cannot move past it.
Yeah.
So refraining from saying things like what I had just said, like, just calm down, because that just like adds to their shame if they're already struggling with it.
Absolutely.
And it just downplays them, and makes you feel like you're an idiot.
Well, and the truth is, if they could calm down, or
they would have done it already.
They would have done it already.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So I just listening with an empathetic ear, like,
Okay.
even again, if it's in the back of your brain, like, okay, this is not that big a deal. We can just, we don't even have to worry about this. We're saying, like, okay, this sounds like it's really taking up a lot of your brain space right now. What is it that we can do that can help you either move past this, or help you feel like this is resolved, or make you feel like you're in a safer space with it? And so maybe it's just like listening to them. They may not even be able to come right out and tell you like a solution, because often I don't necessarily have a solution. I just know that this feels like a really big deal. But knowing somebody else is listening, and they're also there beside me, and they're going to be there to confront whatever this thing that feels really big, that takes some of the burden off of myself.
So two things, I'm hearing two things. Number one, watch the phrasing and the language of how we are speaking to our loved one, and just calm down is not a good one. And I agree with you. I'm really big on phrasing. I can see a lot of times I'll say to my husband, I can see that you're really bothered by this right now. How can I help you? And sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. And sometimes just saying that, articulating that I see that, and I'm aware of that, is giving him permission to feel like he's okay in his space. And so there's a difference between, will you just calm down? This is not a big deal. And I can see that you're really bothered by this. Those two different things are, and I still might think on the inside, this is not a big deal, but you know what? It is to him in that moment. Yeah. And so thank you for that. So anxiety seems to be really off the chart, prevalent everywhere. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we're seeing such a huge increase in anxiety? It's almost epidemic.
Yeah. I know that some might roll their eyes and feel like, oh, this is the easy scapegoat, but I'm going to say it right here, it is phones and technology and high-speed internet.
Yeah.
I think because it's accumulated and gotten to a certain point, like, yes, we could be like, oh, it's been around for 20 years, but it's been that progressive, like, building on up more and more and more of that. And I think that time in our lives where all of us were home and couldn't go anywhere, and our only way to do anything was with a screen and high-speed internet, we that kind of exploded it even further
Mm-hmm.
because like we were created to have community and share space with other humans. And so
Mm-hmm.
it is. I mean, what we're doing here right now, we have a screen and we have technology that you and I could do this. I'm across
Yeah,
the country from you.
I
So I'm not
know.
saying this is not a good thing,
Right.
but when we are replacing all of that face-to-face connection with all of our screens and so much of our life, like
Mm-hmm.
hours upon hours of our day are
Yeah.
spent with screens, it and because like technology and high speed internet, everything is fast. And so
Yes.
we're moving faster and we're connecting less.
Yeah.
And those things just they're just building up in us.
And I that a few years ago, I remember when, excuse me, I remember a few years ago when Kobe Bryant died and the
Mm-hmm.
helicopter crashed. Within moments of it happening, the whole world knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my husband and I were sitting in church, and he had his phone in his hand, and this text message came across because he gets these text messages from like sports and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And when he saw it, it was like I could tell that his emotions, he didn't know how to do with it. And it made me remember something my grandmother years and years and years ago, my grandmother would say, the world, and this was before technology. This
Mm-hmm.
was even before technology. It was when my kids were little. She would say, "You know why we had clotheslines?" She used to say, "Carole Lee, you know why we had clotheslines? It was because we would put our clotheslines right next to the fence line, and we would go out with our neighbor, our friend who was
Mm-hmm.
our neighbor every day, and we would gossip about whatever was going on in the city while we hung our clothes out to dry." Now, if you think about it, we get news at such massive speed that our body, I don't think our minds
Mm-hmm.
were created
No,
to
they
to
weren't.
to really to really compile the amount of information. I was with my 9-year-old grandson a few weeks ago, and we were putting a puzzle together, and he got frustrated because we were really struggling. And this is a hard puzzle. This is like an adult like puzzle, like all like two colors in the whole puzzle.
Oh man, those are
And he
tough.
got so frustrated, and he goes, "Can we just Google how to do this?"
Uh,
And I thought, how telling is that?
yeah,
That we can just Google and information is right there. So yeah, I agree with you. And it is the easy answer, but I think it's the true answer. I
yeah,
do think it's the true answer. And I will say that face-to-face conversation is so much better. And yes, I'm thankful that we have technology because we can stay in touch.
mm-hmm.
We can stay in touch with each other. But I also love the beauty of meeting someone for a first time when you've been with them when you've been with them on
Yeah,
technology for years, and then
yeah,
meeting them in person. It's a sweet moment.
yeah.
So as we close out this morning, I have one more question for you. Since this podcast is to encourage caretakers on their journey, how would you describe an intentional life for a caretaker?
Yeah, I'm going to pull something from my book, Numbering Our Days. There is, at the end of every devotion, I have these 3 questions, and they focus on these 3 words: to recognize, reconnect, and refocus.
Ooh, beautiful.
And it again looks through those 7 different areas of our life that I mentioned earlier, but also like it works through these things. So you recognize the part of your life that you're focusing on the temporal,
Mm-hmm.
and then reconnect what you're doing there, because some things you just have to do.
Yeah.
You're caretaking. There's so many things that you just have to do. You can't, and they feel very temporal, but there's
Mm-hmm.
parts of that you can connect to an eternal perspective. And then once you've made that connection between the temporal and the eternal, then refocus your intention with the eternal in mind, with a focus on God.
Ooh, I like that. I like that.
So, yeah.
So
So,
it's go ahead.
yeah,
I'm
I would
with
say
you,
that
Chad.
just like as Christians, we're called to live differently, that
Mm-hmm.
this world isn't our home and we have another city waiting for us. So that 3-step process just helps keep our perspective on eternity.
Yeah. Yeah. This morning I was having a conversation with my mom, and I'm part of her caretaking team. And we got to a point where we realized she can no longer shower by herself. She wasn't. And so we had to have a conversation I had to have a conversation with her about, now there's going to be a nurse who's going to come in and they're going to help you. And I didn't know how that would go. And so I was pray leading up to the conversation, and then talking about the need. And I was doing my best sales job, after I've prayed up, now I'm doing my best sales job. And boy, I did not realize how she would respond, but she actually started crying. And I'm like, is this a good cry or a bad cry? Mom? And she said, I'm just so humbled that you love me enough that you're going to take care of me in this way.
Mm.
And so there's two things going on. There's me communicating with her about this need, but then there's her saying, okay, I'm going to give up another independence, but I really need the help. So I think it's understanding. I like that, wrapping it with God, because really that's how we need to approach our all of our caretaking as a caretaker. So thank you so much for this authentic, transparent, meaningful conversation today, Nicole. And I'm really big on self-care. And because I believe that if we don't take care of ourselves as caretakers, then we're not going to be able to take care of anyone else. And there have been times where I have not taken care of myself, and I have found myself depleted and tired and almost falling into the anxiety problem that my loved one has. So I am really big on that. So my question for you, and I like to ask all my guests at the end of our interview, is what are you going to do, Miss Nicole, in the next 24 hours to take care of you?
Yeah, great question. I'm also an advocate for self-care. I will put this caveat in that we need to make sure our self-care is nurturing and not numbing.
Yes.
Because if we just keep going to these numbing things and we're calling it self-care, we are going to get, like, that self-care is not really going to help. We are going to get burnt out. And I'm talking to just scrolling on a phone and numbing ourselves or just staring at a screen again. Yeah. Like, those things aren't necessarily nurturing you. But taking walks outside, making sure you're drinking plenty of water, eating a really delicious snack like cheese and crackers. I think the one for me, because that tends to be one that I have to keep reminding myself, is to slow down. My anxiety tells me that I have to keep going faster and faster. It just, in my body, it feels like that's what I need to do. And I find that just actually moving slower, not stopping altogether, but just moving slower communicates to the rest of me that I am safe. Yeah. And so I even just, as I'm like getting a meal around or folding laundry, I envision myself as I'm doing it like a fluid motion, like I'm a ballerina. I know it sounds really silly, but just doing it gracefully kind of makes me slow down. And it also just communicates to the rest of me that I'm safe.
I love that. So beautiful. Well, thank you so much. Now, how can our listeners get in touch with you?
Yeah. So the best place just to start is my website, livewithintent.org. Okay. And on there, they can sign up for my weekly devotional I send out every Friday. And it looks at a small moment, a small prayer, a small verse. And so that just gets sent to your inbox. You also can access all my books there. Okay. I also have a Peace and Purpose course. It's like 8 weeks. They're delivered to your inbox once a week. And that has videos and resources that are unlimited or lifetime access with those. Okay. And they're just exclusive to those who take the course. Okay, great. And the other, I also have been doing intentional living strategy calls, that if you're wanting to just talk more through what intentional living looks like in your life, that we can just do like a startup call. And we can go from either, it can just be one, or we can like set out setting goals and having more talks through that.
Oh, yay. Well, I will put the link to your website and your social media in the show notes so you can find her books. And you should follow her on social media, and you should go to her website because her devotions are very good. I have seen them. I have read them, and You should get them. So if you would like to know more about my caretaking journey, you're new to the show, the link to my book, Are You Ready to Find Joy When Life Gets Messy, is in my show notes today. I've also included a link to my website where you can find out more about the Caretakers Journey ministry that I have. I encourage you to visit and sign up for my monthly newsletter as well. It keeps you posted on things that are happening, and in the future, in the near future, there's going to be lots of exciting things coming up, and that is where I share them with my followers. And I would also ask if you could hit follow or subscribe to this podcast. That really helps the podcast to be found. The little, what I call the little bots inside the internet, they pay attention to how many followers and subscribers you have. So that's kind of an important thing to do. And then you're also going to know whenever a new episode drops, and the episodes drop every week. Well, I will be back next week with another meaningful conversation about what the caretaker's journey looks like. And until then, it's all about